Thousands of residents are fleeing the Syrian city of Aleppo. An evacuation is currently underway as the humanitarian crisis persists in the city. Russian and Syrian troops have laid siege to the area. Some expert analysis now. We're in conversation with Afro-Middle East Centre Executive Director Jeenah. Good evening to you and a very warm welcome. If we look back to the genesis of the crisis that has happened so far today, it would seem that the slaughter of civilians in Aleppo last week has been a long time coming. Have we reached, do you think, some sort of turning point?
I think we have reached a turning point. The turning point is that with the recapture, if you like, words are very difficult in the situation. With the recapture of Aleppo by the Syrian regime, the rebel groups, the opposition groups have really been battered now and are in a very weak position. And the Russian strategy has been, since last year when they got involved, is to batter the rebel groups into a very weak position so that they could then be dragged to the negotiating table and a kind of political solution imposed on them. So I think that we're going to find greater and faster movement in January towards some kind of a political conclusion to this, led by the Russians. And after the 20th of January, when Donald Trump becomes president of the US, followed very obediently by the Americans.
So already we know that Russia, Iran and Turkey are to hold talks in Moscow within, I understand, the next 48 hours or so. Could that then be the start of this process that you're referring to?
Yes, I believe that it would be. They will. I mean, Turkey has been, of course, always seen as being on the other side compared to the Russians and the Iranians. But they've made some expedient decisions now and are allying themselves with the Russians and Iranians. The deal around the withdrawal or evacuation of East Aleppo was a deal that wasn't struck by the Russians and Americans, but by the Russians and the Turks, for example. So they will reach a kind of framework, I believe, between the three of them about how the process should be taken forward and unfold, and the Russians will then present that on the international stage.
Where does this leave then the United States in the frame of all of this, given that the outgoing Obama administration has been urged on a number of occasions to act more decisively and has failed to do so?
Yes, they failed to do so, and what we've found in the past year is that at the diplomatic level, the Russians became dominant at that level, and the Americans were just able to follow the Russian initiative, and that's going to continue into January. Once Donald Trump becomes president, my own view is that in terms of what he has already said, he will basically leave the entire process to the Russians to conduct, and the Americans will go along with whatever the Russians decide. So essentially, the Americans are, for all intents and purposes, out of the game at this moment.
What does that mean for stability within the region itself then?
Well, I think, you mean in terms of the broader region or just Syria?
Just in terms of the broader region, given that we've seen this battle for Aleppo, it's taken Syrian troops away from the eastern front where they have been battling Islamic State, for instance.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what's going to happen is the Russians are going to try to impose a settlement that will mean that all the groups that are part of the settlement, including the opposition or rebel groups, will ally themselves against the Islamic State group. And so you'll find that the Islamic State group is going to increasingly, it already has been, but increasingly lose its foothold in Syria, as well as, of course, as is happening in Iraq, and is going to be forced into becoming an insurgent group rather than a pseudo-state, as it has been for a while. In terms of stability in the broader region, I mean, I think that this settlement that will be imposed will result in a greater sense of stability. I don't think that necessarily means a greater sense of justice, but a greater sense of stability. The Syrian issue will be forcibly resolved in a sense, and you'll find that the other issues will start working themselves out as a result. Within Syria, however, I don't think that the fighting is going to stop for another good few years. The Islamic State group is one, but Jabhat al-Nusra is going to be identified through this negotiation process also as a target, and so that's another. And then you have a number of smaller local Free Syrian Army groups that will not happily go along with this settlement because they will feel that they have been sold out. Many of them kind of not ideologically linked, but they've just been involved in the fighting against the regime for the past 6 years. And so you could find these pockets of fighting continuing for the next few years, maybe even half a decade or longer.
Thank you very much for the assessment. Afro-Middle East Centre Executive Director Naeem Jeenah talking to Newsnight.